So in yesterday's lesson, we learned about the components of the mammalian heart. And so here is a quick animation just to remind you and to give you a starting point for today's lesson, which is heart rate. And so looking at this animation, you can easily see that those arrows are trying to demonstrate that the directional flow of blood through the heart. But what we haven't broached yet is the topic of, well, what causes the heart to contract in a particular sequence, causing that heartbeat. And that's the topic of today's lesson. So before we begin, what I want to do is to just orient you with respect to the important new structural components of the heart that are associated with heart rate. So let's start with what we already know, which is we have the right side of the heart with the atrium on top and the ventricle on the bottom, and then we see on the left side of the heart the atrium on top and the ventricle on the bottom. And we also notice that the ventricles are quite a bit more muscular, and in particular the left ventricle is very muscular relative to either of the atria. And so what's new is this thing called the SA node and this thing called the AV node. And so these two groups of cells, these two, the SA and the AV node, are a group of cells that set off electrical impulses that direct the heart to beat in a particular sequence. So first of all, we have, like I said, the SA node, and the SA part sounds for sinoatrial. And sino, think like sinus, right? It's a cavity of sorts, the atrium is, and it's a node within that cavity. And it's going to direct an impulse that's basically going to cause the atria to contract. Okay, not just the right atrium, but also the left atrium. And I'm going to show you a little animation later to demonstrate that the sinoatrial node is going to cause both atria to contract at the same time. And so what might the AV stand for in the AV node? It's atrioventricular. So there's a signal sent from the SA node to the AV node, and the AV node is going to stimulate those ventricles to contract together at the same time. And so the rate at which that happens is essentially what determines the heart rate, okay, or the rate at which your heart is going to beat. So again, signal going from SA node to AV node, and then through some different structural components here, which we're going to talk about next. And so this yellow line here is meant to indicate an electrochemical impulse sent across that muscle fiber. So here is, just showing you that, here we go, sinoatrial node, signal sent to atrioventricular node, down through the septum, through these special fibers. We're going to talk about their name in a bit, and I'm going to challenge you to pronounce it. And then, so again, SA node cause the atria to contract, AV node signals the ventricular contraction. So here we go. Now we're putting a few more pieces in here. And this diagram is right from your textbook. So here we see that SA node pushing across to cause the atrial contraction, touching the AV node, which signals these fibers in the septum, which result in ventricular contraction. So these fibers, here's the word I want you to pronounce. Purkinje, that's how we pronounce that. Now, another point of reference is the apex. So apex is just the bottom end of the heart, and that's all that means when I talk about the apex of the heart. All right, so here's a video that I want you to watch. I'm not sure if the sound will work, so I'm going to try to see, and if it doesn't work, you can let me know, and I will link the video with the sound into a separate link in our Google Classroom or in our week plan. Here we go. Let me see.
Transmits signals throughout the heart to control its pumping. The electrical signal starts in the sinoatrial, or SA node, which is located in the upper portion of the right atrium and is known as the natural pacemaker of the heart. The electrical signal passes down to the lower chambers of the heart via the atrioventricular,
the AV
or AV node,
valve,
which controls the signal so the atria contract before the ventricles. In the ventricles, pathways carry the signal throughout the muscle so that they contract at the same time to pump blood to the lungs and through the body.
All right, so there is that. I'm going to head back to our other, to the slideshow. So here we go, some other points. We've talked about the heart rate and what controls it, the SA and AV nodes respectively. But if you're looking at this animation, we've seen it before of the heart just beating. You know, I know there's a ride that I went on. It was like at a water park in Florida where you stand on it. You're on this tall building and they have that lub-dub sound of the heartbeat going. And it just really is unnerving before they drop you down this hole, this slide. Anyway, but where does that lub-dub come from? That bump, 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 which is often referred to as the lub-dub sound. And another thing, what are we looking at here? What does this have to do with your heart beating? Why is it creating that particular sequence of peaks and little dips? What is that called, by the way? It's called an electrocardiogram, or ECG. So let's explore. So first of all, I'm really happy this all got into the little window here. But anyway, so let's take a look. Here is one full cycle, one full cardiac cycle, we call it. Okay, and I want to focus in on this zone right here where we see that little bump. And that little bump, as the description says, is an electrical impulse traveling from the SA node to the walls of the atria, causing them to contract. So that little bump right here is describing the contraction of the atria. And so then what happens next? Well, that SA node is going to signal the AV node. And so that's what we see in this little kind of zone right in here of our ECG. And that's just the time it takes for the SA node to hit the AV node. Okay, so then this little dip right here is where we can see the AV node signaling the Purkinje fibers down through that septum, and that's going to signal it going all the way down to the heart's apex. Well, what's going to happen next? Well, the final part of that, we've had the atria contract. Now we need our ventricles to contract, and that's where we see that great big spike here. And it's called an electrocardiogram because we are measuring, the electrical impulse as it travels through the heart muscle fibers. Now, one thing that we don't see in this particular diagram is this little hump right here. And so let's just revisit the sequence of events here, and then that will help us to figure out what this must be. Right? So we have atria contracting, AV node getting its signal from the SA node. Okay, those signal passing through the Purkinje fibers to the apex, and then finally our ventricles contracting. So what must have to happen in order to get back to the beginning of this cycle? Well, the ventricles must have to relax, and that's what we're seeing right here. Some other details that are important to talk about. Sometimes the different segments of that cardiac cycle, as shown as on an electrocardiogram, are given the letters PQRST, as you can see here. And if you've already gone through the lesson on blood pressure, then you will have already learned about systole and diastole. So systole is contraction. So that's the squeezing in of the heart, and diastole describes the rest period. So we have the rest period of the atria, then we have them contract. That's our systole. Okay. At the same time, while our atria are contracting, our ventricles are just kind of relaxing. They're not contracting at all. They're relaxed. Okay, but then all of a sudden we have ventricular contraction here, ventricular systole. All in the meanwhile, our atria are just relaxing, right? But then we reach the T point in that electrocardiogram, and that's where our ventricles are going to be relaxing. We call that ventricular diastole. Okay? So again, diastole, relaxing, systole, is contracting. Now let's put it all together here. So we can see here that we can see atria contracting and then ventricles contracting. Now what I want you to look really closely at next are the valves, the AV valves. Okay, now notice that the two atria are contracting at the same time and our two ventricles are contracting at the same time. But also notice that at the beginning of the ventricles contracting, our tricuspid and our mitral valve are closing at the same time. So the lub sound in the lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub of the heart, the lub sound is caused by the closing of the tricuspid and mitral valves that happens at the beginning of our ventricular contraction or ventricular systole. Now, what is the dub? The dub refers to the semilunar valves, and we can only see here the pulmonary semilunar valve, but we know that the aortic semilunar should be somewhere behind in here. When it closes, that forms the dub part of the lub-dub sound, and that happens at the very end of ventricular contraction, right? So I'm going to try to get in a sequence here so that it matches the animation. Oh, I'm going to have a hard time with this. Lub-dub, 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 lub-dub. There we have it. So some people will say, well, isn't the lub part the atria contracting and the dub part the ventricles contracting? No, it does not have to do with that. It has to do with the closing of the valves at their particular time. Okay, so another thing I wanted to talk about is that, all of these signals are coming from our nervous system. And in the grade 12 course, we will expand upon this, talking about the autonomic nervous system, which deals with those unconscious actions, right? We don't tell our heart to beat. It just beats at the rate that it needs to beat at. And so that's all controlled by our brain. So one nerve is going to stimulate an increase in our heartbeat, and the other one's going to trigger a decrease in our heartbeat. So what would be some situations or some conditions under which your brain would be telling your heart to beat faster? I want you to think about that for a second. And pause the video if you need to. So one scenario possibly would be when you are exerting yourself during physical exercise. And so when you're exerting yourself during physical exercise, the body has greater energy demands. And if you have greater energy demands, your body needs to burn glucose faster. To burn glucose faster, you also need oxygen to produce energy to support the additional activity. So how is your body going to get the oxygen from your lungs to where it needs to go and from your digestive system to where it needs to go? Well, it does that via the circulatory system. So if your body needs to burn energy faster, you need to get those reactants, the oxygen and the glucose, to the mitochondria at a faster rate. So that would be one example. So the rate of your heartbeat is basically determined by those energy demands. So, your heart rate will go up with physical activity because your body has greater energy demands during physical activity. I think that makes sense. So the average resting heart rate is 70 beats per minute. It'd be interesting for you to go back to the lab that we did last time when we were looking at the respiratory system to see how your heart rate compares. Okay, so last but not least, there are individuals who have health conditions that causes there to be a malfunction in the SA node. So if you have a defective SA node, how is your heart knowing how to beat and in what particular sort of rate? Well, sometimes your heart, in fact, can stop beating, and you need a kind of like a kickstart to that. And so what you're seeing over here, I'm hoping you recognized it. It's a pacemaker, and a pacemaker is implanted in your chest, and its goal is to be that kickstart. So if you do have a faulty SA node, you can have, we're really lucky that science has led to the development of the pacemaker, and you may know somebody who has a pacemaker, in fact, that's implanted. So that is it about heart rate. If you have any questions, feel free to reach me via Zoom. or email to clarify any points that you struggled with, and I'll be happy to help you out.